Back in January, I started seeing a lot of image macros from this fly-by-night conspiracy theorist website. And basically, they made a very startling claim. They said that in 1999, a jury found the United States government responsible for being part of a grand collaboration to assassinate the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I did some research and I found out, you know what? There is some truth to that. But as much as there's some truth to that, there's actually a lot more nonsense because it's actually kind of a sham trial. And in fact, all the stuff about this being proof that the government was involved in some sort of grand conspiracy to assassinate the beloved civil rights icon is actually non existent. And I'll go into that a little bit later on. Okay, so most of you know what I'm talking about. You've seen it. Federal government was found guilty of destroying Martin Luther King Jr. Well, not quite. We need to actually talk about the case itself before we get into the reasons why it's all a bunch of bunk and completely not admissible as evidence of any sort of conspiracy whatsoever. So basically what we're talking about here is a court case from December of 1999 called King versus Jowers. It's actually a wrongful death suit, which is filed by Coretta Scott King and the rest of the King family against Lloyd Jowers, and we'll talk about him later on. It was a civil suit, so it wasn't actually a criminal trial. It was basically just a random civil suit filed in Shelby County, Tennessee. So basically, here's what it was. The gist of it is this guy, Lloyd Jowers, was a participant in a conspiracy against Martin Luther King. So anyway, that's what the King prosecuting attorney said about this Jowers fellow. And they read the verdict, and it went on from November 15th to December 8th. There were about 70 witnesses involved. And they found two things. Number one, they found that yes, indeed, that this Jowers fellow was involved in a conspiracy of some sort against Martin Luther King Jr., and that also there were certain government agencies which were parties to that conspiracy as alleged by the defendant. And for this wrongful death suit, which was filed against Jowers, and I quote, and other unknown co-conspirators, the family received $100 as part of the settlement. So, that's the facts of the case. Yes, there was a civil suit filed in Memphis. Yes, an individual named Lloyd Jowers was found to be involved as a participant in a wrongful death case, some sort of conspiracy involving harm against Martin Luther King Jr., more on that later. And that somehow some unnamed, unspecified government agencies were involved in part of some conspiracy to do harm to Martin Luther King Jr. So that's the facts of the case. Now let's talk about this Lloyd Jowers guy and some of the other participants in this great, fantastical story. Jowers was a guy who owned a restaurant which was very close to the Lorraine Motel, which is where Martin Luther King was struck down by a sniper's bullet in the late 60s. So anyway, his big claim to fame is in 1993, he started running around saying that both the U.S. government and the mafia were involved in a conspiracy to take the life of Martin Luther King Jr. He said that James Earl Ray was a scapegoat, and the real gunman was a Memphis police lieutenant named Earl Clark. But of course, Earl Clark wasn't there at the trial to defend himself, and of course, if you actually look at the suit itself, it does not blame this guy that was fingered by Lloyd Jowers for being responsible for King's death. So that's kind of an important plot point. The really strange thing here about the case, the 1999 civil suit, was that the attorney for King's family was also the attorney, that last attorney for James Earl Ray during his initial trial for the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. It's a guy named William Pepper. And in case you're wondering, yes, he is a doctor, so he literally is named Dr. Pepper, which is one of those things that's just really hilarious to me. And every time I read the court documents, I can't help but chuckle a little. All you need to know about Pepper is he is a guy who has pretty much made his living following conspiracy theories, in addition to really kind of vaunting about with this MLK government conspiracy hullabaloo. He's also involved in a conspiracy theory of sorts, claiming that RFK was framed and his murder was set up by the government or some other organization. He's also a 9/11 truther. So this is a guy who has basically made his living off following these really bizarre, whack job conspiracy theories. So keep that in mind. Now, the only thing I think that's really more interesting here than the fact that you've got this unabashed conspiracy theorist wacko as the prosecutor is that the defender himself was a guy named Lewis Garrison. And, we all know about trials. You've got the prosecutor who's saying, oh, well, the guy did this, and you have the defendant's attorney who's saying, well, no, he didn't, here's why he's innocent. Well, in the civil suit, it really didn't work out like that because there really wasn't a defense to speak of. In fact, Mr. Jowers' defense, Lewis Garrison, actually said that he agreed with pretty much all of the prosecutor, Dr. Pepper's conspiracies about Martin Luther King being done in by an overarching conspiracy of everybody, the FBI, the Mafia, Department of Justice, CIA, everybody's involved in it. In fact, the only thing that Garrison disagreed with Pepper on was the extent to which his defendant, Lloyd Jowers, was involved. So, right off the bat, you're kind of getting some inklings that this was not a quote-unquote real trial going on. This was something where there was clear collusion between the prosecutor and the defense. And in fact, you look at it, Lloyd Jowers and the King family actually worked together to actually bring this thing to a civil suit to begin with. So it's a case where there's absolutely no defense really going on at all. You got the prosecutor and the defense basically being buddy-buddy over what is nothing more than a $100 settlement. So if you ever hear the term kangaroo court, this thing is already hopping around. And another problem that no one brings up, and you're going to see on the little image macros that pop up every year, is the language of the verdict. If you look at what was found in the actual ruling from this trial, the term assassinate is never actually used in the document. It doesn't say that the government or even Mr. Jowers was involved in a conspiracy to assassinate Martin Luther King. It just said that there was some sort of conspiracy going on to do harm. That's the terminology they use within the actual court documents against Martin Luther King. And oh, by the way, when they say that there were government agencies that were parties to a conspiracy, they're not saying this the conspiracy to murder MLK. Too many initials going on in the mid-20th century. There weren't government agencies in collusion to assassinate, just that they were part of a conspiracy that was alleged by Lloyd Jowers and the King family. So we have actually two competing conspiracy theories going on here in the verdict, and well, there's quite a few problems with that. As far as the major problems with this civil suit ruling, well, there's quite a few. Oh, and by the way, do you like the shirt? I got it from the estate sale of Charlton Heston. $5. Problems with the civil suit. Number one, there were absolutely no individuals or even government agencies named in the verdict. When they say that this wrongful death against Martin Luther King was perpetrated by other unknown co-conspirators, they mean exactly that. They don't name names. There isn't a single person listed by first or last name, or even their association with any organization, government or otherwise, listed as being responsible for the death of Martin Luther King in this case. Therefore, it's basically just the blandest, vaguest statement ever, which is that government agencies were parties to a conspiracy which may or may not have resulted in Martin Luther King's death. That's really not good evidence to support the fact that the government was involved in an assassination attempt or the actual assassination of Martin Luther King. That's called bad logic, it's called bad faith, and overall it's just a bad ruling. So, outside the fact that no one was actually found legally culpable for the death of Martin Luther King in this civil suit, there's other problems. There's the aforementioned collusion between the parties. Obviously, you had Pepper and Garrison who were on the same page with the conspiracy theories, and in fact, King and Jowers actually worked together to even get this thing to a civil court to begin with. But another thing is you got to look at the testimony and pleadings. They were actually cooperatively submitted by King and Jowers, which means all the testimony and all the witnesses and all the evidence was submitted during this trial was actually presented in a joint effort by the defense and the prosecutor. So instead of it being an actual case where you have one side saying the other side did something and the other side defending themselves, you basically had them working together to go towards this one settlement of saying, yes, there was a conspiracy of sorts. but maybe this Jowers guy wasn't as involved in it as much as the prosecutor says. I'm the only person kind of seeing that a little suspect, that maybe that's not the U.S. legal system as it ought to be arranged. And of course, another big problem with the entire trial is the fact that there was absolutely no government evidence submitted during the trial. So even though they're out there blaming the CIA and the FBI and whoever for being responsible for Martin Luther King's death, guess who was never called on the witness stand? Guess who was never given an opportunity to go to trial? Guess who never actually had documents shown up in their defense? Once again, the huge, gaping, gigantic problem with the civil suit is basically the fact that, there is no defense. It was a one-sided, basic public demonstration under the guise of a civil suit, which is bad. But what do you know? Who cares about actual legal systems in this day and age? And of course, you got to talk about the reliability of the testimony, which is very suspect. Basically, there was no tangible proof whatsoever submitted during this case to verify that there was a governmental collusion to assassinate Martin Luther King. In fact, it was all pretty much hearsay, most of it secondhand and thirdhand from people who have already been debunked and discredited in later DOJ investigations. So basically, there were 70 witnesses or so placed on the witness stand, and only 3 of them actually had firsthand accounts of what happened that morning at the Lorraine Motel. That's bad. Those are not the most reliable witnesses. Their testimony is foggy. And of course, you got to talk about all the different holes in Jowers' story to begin, because there's a lot of contradictory claims. Let's talk about the character of this Jowers fellow. This is a guy who's been saying that he was involved in some grandiose conspiracy to assassinate Martin Luther King since 1993. But over the course of the years, he's disavowed his own confession. At several points during the trial and throughout his claims, he named 2 different assassins being responsible. So that's contradictory. He changed his story about receiving $100,000 to hire a hitman to assassinate Martin Luther King, saying he just held the money for them. And he's totally inconsistent about his own role in the alleged plot to assassinate Martin Luther King. He's totally changed his story multiple times about how far the Memphis police were involved. And he changed his story multiple times about how the alleged murder weapon was discarded. So this is the guy that has basically changed his mind several times. His story has not been consistent. Basically, everything he's saying has been incredibly unreliable through and through. And of course, there's the turd in the punch bowl, the fact that he's been trying to quote-unquote sell his story as a movie and book for years. So he's definitely got the profit motive going on here. And something that you're probably not going to be hearing from all these conspiracy theories folks and people posting things on Facebook is there actually was a full United States Department of Justice investigation looking into the findings from the civil case. And basically, they told you everything I just told you, that this was not really an actual legal suit. This was just a one-handed, biased, one-sided public demonstration under the guise of being a civil case. And here's a direct quote from them. The evidence introduced in King v. Jowers support various conspiracy allegations consisted of either inaccurate or incomplete information or unsubstantiated conjecture, supplied most often by sources, many unnamed, who did not testify. So what's the point? What does this really abstract civil case actually prove then? It doesn't prove anything. It just proves that you've got a bunch of people with a lot of money who basically got together, decided to rent a courtroom, and basically get their political agendas out there. Nothing more. It doesn't prove there's a government conspiracy. There's no tangible documentation. I mean, come on, we know this. There are conspiracies out there like COINTELPRO and Northwoods, but we know they're conspiracy theories and they're conspiracy facts because we actually have documented proof from the U.S. Department of Justice and the FBI and CIA and all these other memos. We don't have that to verify a Martin Luther King assassination conspiracy. In fact, you can go look at the FBI vault yourself. They have paperwork on everybody. During the what was his name? The J. Edgar Hoover administration. It was very totalitarian. So you can go and look at all the documents, and as much as those have been leaked and put out there, nothing verifying a grand government collusion between all these agencies to assassinate Martin Luther King Jr. They don't exist. If they don't exist, you don't have proof, and in a court of law, especially one with the government listed as a defendant, you actually need some documentation from the government to back up the plans, and they just don't have them. So you look at this and you're trying to tell me which one is more likely scenario here, the accepted narrative or this narrative posited by the 1999 civil case. So which one of these sounds more likely? That the United States government and all these alphabet soup of agencies got together and tried to hire this Jowler guy to pay some other guy on the Memphis police force to put a bullet in Martin Luther King to end his political dissidence, in this grand, overarching 4,000-page testimony, which you can read, and I have a link to at the bottom, with all these actors involved, which ultimately led to King's assassination. Or the fact that there's this guy named James Earl Ray who, by 1959, already accumulated 20 years for multiple felonies, who escaped prison in 1967 and was a fugitive of law, who was a volunteer for George Wallace and an admirer of Ian Smith's racist regime in Rhodesia, where the FBI found maps with Martin Luther King's home and church circled in his hotel room, and tried to escape the country and lived in Canada under an assumed name, trying to get away from law enforcement around the same time Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. So it seems to me there's quite a bit more evidence to say that perhaps this James Earl Ray fellow acted alone because he was just some ideologically driven racist who wanted to make himself famous. Or it could be a gigantic Leviathan-esque government con job. I don't know. One seems a little bit more likely than the other, but one kind of refutes the idea of anyone having individual conscious choice, which is really the heart of all these conspiracy theories to begin with. So what do I think about this? Okay, well, you had the civil case ruling, but it was a really crappy trial. It didn't actually name any names, didn't name any agencies, and it actually didn't establish the veracity of any singular conspiracy theory presented by the King family or even Jowler as being authentic or legally binding as what actually happened historically. So what do I make of this? I think this is one of those instances where the King family, they lost their patriarch, and there are lots of people out there that don't want to believe that someone as historically important was just simply killed by some guy who was an opportunist. A guy with a lot of hate and anger and prejudice in his heart saw an opportunity, took it, and got him. People can't accept that. They want a different narrative. They want something a little bit more heroic. They want something more grandiose and more fantastical. They want something a little bit more legendary because they just can't accept the simple fact that, reality is unpredictable. People have free choice. And if you look at all these conspiracy theories, they all kind of do the exact same thing. They say that you as an individual do not have conscious choice. They're putting drugs in the water. They're sending out media messages to you. The billboards are brain controlling you. There's all these Manchurian candidates out there. Basically, it's telling you that you're not responsible for your own actions, which is kind of ironic because all these guys are always talking about personal right and personal liberty, but the very heart of their agenda is this core concept that you as an individual don't have the ability to make your own judgments, which I think is pretty much what happened in the case of the Martin Luther King assassination. You got a guy who is racist as all hell, who has some weaponry, who found an opportune time and did it. Why? I don't know, because maybe he was just dumb. Maybe he didn't think it through. Maybe he was so blinded by hatred and anger and rage and all these other things that he thought it was a good cause. Of course, I thought George Wallace would be elected president and he would, let him out of prison immediately afterwards, and he'd be able to go to Rhodesia and live life as an icon for what he did, which sounds a little bit more realistic than the whole government cover-up thing to me, because that happens all the time. So, really, what more? It's nothing more than a bought-off courtroom, which was used as a political leverage point ever since by the King family and all these conspiracy theorists. And at the end of the day, it's just nothing more than a futile attempt to put organized meaning behind tragedy, because for some reason we can accept the fact that there's 100 million people involved in this gigantic overarching plot to silence dissidents and keep the status quo going, but we can't for 1 second believe the fact that people have conscious individual will, and sometimes they do really bad, tragic things with it. In the case of this James Earl Ray fellow, who, much to the chagrin of all of you whack jobs out there, did it because he wanted to and nobody else told him to. So there you go. That's the truth behind the 1999 civil case behind Martin Luther King, where it was discovered, quote unquote, that the government was involved in some conspiracy which may or may not have involved the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And it has absolutely everything in it that you need to know, except, actual evidence.